Isn't it ironic that pacifism can lead to war? If you look back at the events that led to World War I, that's exactly what happened. America was indifferent when war broke out in Europe. Instead of acting boldly and swiftly to tame an aggressive Germany, America sat back until Britain and France were on the verge of defeat. The parallels to Ukraine today are unmistakable. Apart from largely ineffective Russian sanctions and a very slow trickle and buildup of military supplies and support, America has really sat back in supporting Ukraine, and now with the mega wing of the Republican Party in firm control of the U.S. House of Representatives and Speaker Mike Johnson as of today, April 12th, refusing to still bring the vote to the floor of the House on whether to continue to give Ukraine aid and the support that it needs in defense against an aggressive Russia, America is destined to continue sitting back until this impasse can be solved. At this point, a stalemate might be the best case scenario for Ukraine. And most of that is due to American pacifism and inaction and an unwillingness to provoke Putin further or fear that certain weaponry that could have been very helpful to Ukraine at the beginning of the war could have been perceived as escalating the conflict. The far mega right in America has been pounding the drumbeats of America first as a justification for withholding further aid. On the eve of America entering World War I, after unrestricted German submarine warfare had taken far too many innocent civilian lives, President Woodrow Wilson reversed course. He had made countless assurances as war raged throughout Europe, much as it does in Ukraine today, that European wars were of matters of indifference to Americans. By 1917, almost 2 years after a German U-boat sank the Lusitania, a passenger liner, which was carrying munitions and supplies, military supplies for Great Britain, thousands of people perished, including many American civilians. But it was even 2 years after that America still hadn't even entered the war. But at that point in 1917, President Wilson, he finally recognized that the world was on fire with tinder everywhere. He argued that Americans deluded themselves if they imagined that the United States could remain untouched by the fire, sparks, and embers. Does that sound similar at all? Much of the rhetoric that we hear from the very far right in America seems to think that we can escape those sparks and embers. And if anything, the world is far more globalized and interconnected today, both geopolitically, economically, socially, than it ever was in 1917. World War I, though, did not have to reach that escalatory point that it did in 1917. There have been plenty of opportunities to be forceful without the use of violence against an aggressive Germany. The American public, though, simply remained indifferent. American pacifism had taken hold, much in the way that MAGA today has co-opted American foreign policy toward Ukraine and taken a very isolationist, pacifist stance, thinking that basically if we ignore the Ukraine issue and just move on with our lives with an America first mindset, that everything in the world will be okay. It will sort itself out. It's not our problem over there. But history cautions against the dangers of American pacifism and the potential consequences it has for security and democracy around the world. In this episode, we'll first talk about how American pacifism led to World War I, and then we'll discuss how American pacifism is leading us into a potentially catastrophic World War III. We'll conclude with what America and the world can do today to avoid that catastrophic World War III from a geopolitical and foreign policy perspective. But first, let's talk about how American pacifism led to World War I. Before World War I, the United States adhered to a largely isolationist foreign policy with widespread public sentiment for neutrality. America actively sought to avoid entanglement in European conflicts. Neutrality was so obvious for America that President Wilson drafted a proclamation of neutrality the moment World War I was declared. This stance was driven in part by the country's mixed ethnic population. There were significant German, Irish, and other ethnic groups harboring different allegiances and sympathies. It may surprise some that the Irish were actually very supportive of the German cause because they absolutely despise Great Britain. Meanwhile, many folks in the Eastern establishment in the United States were very supportive of Great Britain and France and believed in defending democracy, whereas upon crossing the Allegheny Mountains and heading further west in America, people didn't care. They were indifferent. They only worried about putting food on their own tables and their own security. But there were significant economic implications with the First World War for Americans, whether they were in the Eastern establishment or across the Allegheny Mountains. Europe was a large buyer of American products, including cotton. As Robert Kagan describes in his book, The Ghost at the Feast, the Kansas farmer's motto was, "I don't care a darn what happens, so long as it doesn't happen to me." But they definitely did give a darn if their livelihoods were impacted, if their bales of cotton were sitting on docks, not going to European markets. That's when Americans truly started to care. So we reopened trade with Europe, but very slow to start. But beyond trade, there wasn't much American action until it finally entered the war in 1917. It took a very neutral and pacifist approach to supporting the Allies against Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This neutral and pacifist approach backfired in two big ways. The first was moral and ideological. It became clear to many over time that Germany was not a fan or in favor or would ever promote liberal democratic values. They rejected liberalism and individualism in favor of duty, order, and justice, where the state was firmly in control of society. Does that sound like Putin's Russia to you? Because it sure does to me. It's eerily similar to the rise of autocracy that we see across the 2024 world today, from China to Russia to Iran, North Korea. The second way that this neutral and pacifist approach backfired was physical and economic. The sinking of the Lusitania in 1915 killed over 1,000 passengers, including many American citizens. This changed the nature of the relationship between the United States and Germany. It's similar to how revelations of the inhumane massacre in Bucha by Russian troops changed the nature of any peace negotiations. One of the favorite lines of MAGA or American isolationists in countering any defense of Ukraine is pointing out that Ukraine had options to negotiate a peace with Putin in the early days of the war. But what they always seem to fail to mention is what thwarted those options and what led to Zelensky ultimately leaving the bargaining table. And that was the revelations of what happened in Bucha, where Russian troops were tracked via cellular phone to have massacred many Ukrainians. Innocent civilians were massacred in Bucha. That forever changed the state of the war, and it forever affected any peace agreement that Zelensky or any of the Ukrainian people would ever agree to. But bringing it back to America in World War I, even after the Lusitania tragedy, many Americans were still fearful that President Woodrow Wilson would rush the nation into war. President Wilson's goal was to keep the United States out of the war at all costs, but he also wanted to avoid national dishonor and personal humiliation. So basically, he didn't want to be seen as a pawn of Germany, just getting pushed around by a rising power on the European continent. His efforts, though, for trying to keep America out of the war were ultimately significantly undermined by Germany, who continued to increase the aggressiveness of their actions, especially with their U-boats. The Royal Navy in Great Britain had secured safe passage for American merchant and passenger vessels, civilian ships, from across the Atlantic into British waters. But U-boats were continuously picking them off. And while they agreed for a temporary halt of unrestricted submarine warfare, at a certain point, the German Kaiser in early 1917 basically gave U-boat captains carte blanche in taking down anything and everything that they came across without warning and without aid to any of the crew or passengers on a sinking ship that they had torpedoed. So more ships were sunk by German U-boats, more American lives were lost. Trade was disrupted. The flagrant and indiscriminate actions by Germany led to America's entry into the war. But all of this begged the question, what if America had not taken such a pacifist, isolationist stance sooner? What if America had acted more boldly and deterrent toward a more belligerent, flagrantly acting Germany? Let's now compare the American pacifism that led up to World War I to the American pacifism today that is arguably leading us to World War III. The parallels between the pre-World War I period and the current geopolitical conflict in Ukraine is striking. Just as the German Kaiser viewed the United States as impotent and incapable of decisive action in 1917, Putin views the United States today as a declining great power, incapable of steering its divided democratic ship and unwilling to take decisive military action. Putin, like the German Kaiser, attacks on weakness, not strength. This perception of American weakness and indecision has emboldened Putin, much like the German Kaiser's assessment of the United States led to his increasingly aggressive submarine warfare. Consider what will happen if America pulls back and leaves Ukraine to fend for itself. Putin will have his way, not only in Ukraine, but across his entire expanding sphere of influence. To assume he will not act even more emboldened by threatening a NATO country is not the bet any rational, sane person should be willing to make. America ultimately concluded as much after its prolonged pacifism led it into World War I. President Wilson ultimately realized that a powerful and emboldened Germany that dominated the heart of Europe was not a world that promoted safety and stability. The same is true for a Russia-dominated Ukraine. So many of the Americans calling for peace at all costs today are willing to sell out Ukraine for an immediate ceasefire in the short term, while inviting the fox into the henhouse for the long term. Republicans in Congress no longer want to support Ukraine, allegedly for America First principles, despite it being the cheapest and least costly way, especially in terms of American lives, to destroy Putin's military. A military, by the way, that has started the biggest land war in Europe since World War II. The political divisions amongst Republicans themselves mirror the mixed population with different allegiances that contributed to the isolationist sentiment before World War I. Different factions couldn't agree, so Americans remained indifferent, pacifist, neutral. The German Kaiser did not interpret this as his cue to de-escalate. In fact, he did the opposite. He ramped up U-boat attacks. He attacked more civilian areas, especially in places like Belgium. Similarly, there's no reason to think Putin will interpret American pacifism any differently. Many on the far right in America mistakenly think that he will, that if we just give up on Ukraine and walk away, that Putin will respect us more, that the world will be at more peace. I know what Putin's saying when he says he won't attack NATO countries. I want to believe him, but that has never stopped him from killing dissidents on NATO soil before, or from engaging in information warfare across NATO lines. Pacifism is not deterred as increasingly escalating actions starting in Chechnya, moving to Georgia, and finally now in Ukraine since 2014. Pacifism also doesn't recognize that Putin's Russia is designed for ongoing war, much as Germany was in the early 20th century. Russia also has huge population advantages. Pacifism has never worked against Putin. Most of the evidence suggests it has only emboldened him further. Let's now discuss how we can avoid World War III. First, we must remember one thing, that Putin only responds to force, pure aggression. It may seem counterintuitive that more aggression could bring more peace, but when you're dealing with a bully or mafioso, there's no ability to reason. Terms will be broken just as Russia's assurances to Ukraine were broken after Ukraine agreed to give up all of its nuclear weapons. Bullies and mafia state leaders like Putin only respect great powers that use force to get what they want. The second they smell weakness and are given any inch, they immediately take the mile. America's indecisiveness in supporting Ukraine reeks of weakness. It's akin to the powder keg that Europe had become ahead of World War I, where all it took was one lit match in the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand to send the world up in flames. Now imagine if American pacifism wins the day and Putin has his way with Ukraine. Think how China will interpret it, how any other American ally will interpret it, how any other American adversary will interpret it. Everyone will see that America is weak, that America can be outlasted, that its beautiful system of democracy actually has an ugly onion core that can be manipulated, much in the way that Putin has masterfully manipulated it already. Democracy is painfully indecisive. If America walks away or abandons Ukraine, it will usher in a new world order. America will be cast aside. Autocracy will have won the day for the first time since arguably 1933, when Adolf Hitler was first elected in Germany. The lessons of history from World War I are often focused on its aftermath. The Treaty of Versailles, the punishment of Germany, the conditions that created the rise of Hitler. What we should instead be focused on today are the lessons of history before World War I. What led to it? How could it have been prevented? Deterring Germany from exerting its will on the European continent. Not letting tensions rise to powder keg levels with everyone armed to the teeth. In a world of great powers like America, peace is best kept by force, not goodwill. And to be clear, force does not always mean violence. It can be any form of pressure, including supplying an ally with the means to defend herself. It can also mean preventing an aggressor like Russia from exerting its will on its smaller neighbor, Ukraine. The amazing thing is that America can largely accomplish this without any American boots on the ground. The alternative is a Putin-run Ukraine that will destabilize the region. It will incentivize NATO and its members to start a new arms race. Russia will grow closer to allies like Iran and China. The entire world will be destabilized and on the verge of a World War I beginning, where a seemingly random event could be the match that sparks the war. If America refuses or finds itself incapable of supporting and stabilizing Ukraine, American pacifism will have paved the way for an even greater conflict. World War III. Thank you for listening. Make sure to check out the links in the episode description, and if you haven't already, hit that subscribe and follow button. We'll see you next time.